In the last video, we saw that we may reason from things which change, which is the actualization of a potential, to a foundation of all change whatsoever, which is purely actual. In this video, we will see that we can reason from the reality of things which have parts of various sorts, that is, composite being, to a foundation of all composition which must have no parts whatsoever, and must be entirely free of composition. Put another way, we will reason from the reality of composite being to simple being. As we did in the previous video, we will establish first that there must be something of this sort, namely simple being, and then think a bit more about that to see what this entails to make the full case for the existence of God. We'll then answer a few objections, although many of the same objections brought against this argument have already been answered in the previous video in the argument from change. First, we make a simple observation about the things we see in the world, and that they have parts of various sorts, that there are metaphysically prior beings which are actually assembled into a whole, and in being so assembled thereby lose their identity as separate and independent beings. For example, water is 2 parts hydrogen and 1 part oxygen, and without these parts, namely hydrogen and oxygen, which are distinct elements, there cannot be any water. That is, hydrogen and oxygen gas existing on their own are not water, and so long as hydrogen and oxygen atoms are actually separate, there is no water to speak of. But water only comes about when these parts are assembled in just the right way to actually form water molecules, which also requires hydrogen and oxygen atoms giving up their separate existences, but instead actually becoming parts of water molecules. Now, there must of course be a cause which is responsible for the initial formation of any water molecule, so composite things require causes in at least this sense. But more importantly, there must be a cause which maintains the existence of the water molecule as water specifically, as opposed to the existence of hydrogen and oxygen gas. For water only has existence so long as hydrogen and oxygen atoms are actually parts of the whole. If they are not, then there's simply no water to speak of. Thinking more generally, for any composite being to so much as exist for a moment as a composite being, there must be a cause responsible for the actual composition of the parts into the whole, as opposed to these parts not being so composed, and thus not truly being parts. Without such a cause, there is no composite being to speak of, for in that case, nothing would be responsible for making these parts actually be parts, as opposed to not being parts, and a composite by definition must have parts in order to be what it is. This is just as true for any composite being whatsoever just to exist for a moment, not merely in its initial formation. That composite things require causes is true not only in physical composition, but also in metaphysical composition. Now, everything is such that either its essence is distinct from its existence, or its essence just is its existence. Considering the former sort of thing, in which essence is distinct from existence, here we have another sort of composition, since for anything of this sort to be what it is, and have actual existence, it will need to be a sort of compound of 2 distinct principles, namely essence and existence, neither of which, simply considered on its own, is going to fully account for the real being of something in which essence is distinct from existence. What is required is a cause which is responsible for the conjoining of essence and existence in such things in which essence is distinct from existence, just to be what they are. Here we see, yet again, that composite beings are going to require a composing cause just to exist as composites, not just for physical composition, but also more profoundly metaphysical composition of any sort. We went through some of these concepts regarding essence and existence in part 2 of this series, but we will use them again here in this argument. It's clear to experience that there are at least some things in the world which are made of parts, or composite beings. Now, as composite beings, they will therefore require a cause of their composition. But then we must inquire further into the nature of such a cause which is responsible for the composition. Either this cause is composite or non-composite. Now, if this cause responsible for the first composite thing we are thinking about is itself composite, then this too will require a cause of its own. Once again, this composing cause will either be composite or non-composite. Thinking through the possibilities to fully account for the composition of any composite being whatsoever, we see that we must conclude either one of 2 things. First, for any composite, there is an infinite series of causes, each of which is composite, or there must exist something which is non-composite and responsible for the composition of that first thing we were thinking about. However, just as we've noted elsewhere in this series, there cannot be infinite regresses in series in which each member of the series cannot so much as exist without the more fundamental members in the series. We are asking how this composite thing can exist as a composite being in the here and now. Without such a conjoining cause of that first composite being, It doesn't even exist. But in the case of the infinite regress, that's true just as well of its cause, which would be composite by assumption, and without its conjoining cause, it doesn't even exist, and therefore cannot cause the composition in that first composite thing. Here, we see, as we've seen a few times in this series, that we would have a hierarchical series of composite things, each of which only have their existence as composites in a derived manner from not only the prior member, but all of the more fundamental members in the series all at once. And we've seen already, especially from the previous video, that an infinite series of things, each of which depends upon others in the series for its very existence at any moment, cannot actually account for experienced reality. In part 6, we see that's true of change, and we apply that reasoning here to note that an infinite hierarchical series of composite causes cannot actually account for the reality of composite things. Strictly speaking, even in the entire infinite series of composite causes, there would not be an adequate cause of the composition of anything, and without that cause, there could be no composite things. But this is utterly contrary to experience, since we know there are things in the world made of parts. Hence, we rule out the possibility that an infinite hierarchical series of composite causes is the way reality really is. Therefore, we conclude that there must be something which is non-composite, that is, simple being. Now, it is not possible that there should be many of these simple beings. For suppose there were many simple beings, such as two simple beings. If there were truly two simple beings, then they would have to be different in some way to ground this difference, without which there aren't really two simple beings. But the only way for there to be a difference here is for one to have a part, the other one does not, in which case there would really be two simple beings. But for a simple being to have parts is just contradictory. Therefore, there cannot be many simple beings, only one. So, we rightly say the simple being, or simple being, without any sort of confusion. It also follows that everything other than this simple being is composite, and therefore caused in its existence, and must be caused in its being as a composite by this one simple being. Therefore, this simple being is truly the universal cause of being. Moreover, simple being must be immaterial, because for something to be a material thing entails that it has parts of some sort. And something simple cannot have parts, and therefore must be immaterial. In addition, simple being must transcend the physical world, for the physical world is a composite both in whole and in its parts. Simple being as such is nowhere to be found in the physical world, and hence simple being cannot simply be identified with the universe, and hence pantheism must be false. Now, we were noting above that composition extends into metaphysical composition as well. For something in which essence, it's what it is really distinct from its existence, it's that it is, we have a metaphysical composite of essence and existence at the most fundamental level. For something of this sort, unless essence is conjoined to an active existence, it doesn't even exist. So, for anything in which essence is really distinct from existence, we have an example of a composite being. It follows from this that simple being, not having parts, must not have an essence really distinct from its existence, but its essence just is its existence. Hence, simple being must be subsistent existence itself, which is something we've discussed in previous videos as well. But we reached the same conclusion from the point of view of simplicity. Now, could simple being be a composite of actuality and potentiality? Obviously not, for this too is an example of composition, and it would make no sense to say it's pure potentiality, since pure potentiality doesn't cause anything to exist or be composed, not having any actuality whatsoever. Therefore, simple being must not have any potentiality whatsoever, and must be purely actual. We may also conclude that simple being is immutable from thinking about what change entails. For to change entails being able to gain or lose features. But to gain or lose features would entail either gaining or losing parts, which cannot happen in something with no parts. Hence, simple being must be immutable. In addition, we must conclude that simple being cannot have accidents, or additional being which modifies and inheres in substance, thereby making it be a certain way. For this would entail a composition between the inherent accidents and the substance in which the accident inheres. Therefore, simple being must not be a composite of substance and accident, but rather pure substance. Now, since this simple being is the universal cause of being of everything else, it must have some power to at least some degree, But we should now inquire a bit further into the degree of power it does have. It follows from simplicity that simple being cannot be a composite of substance with its superadded various powers, and therefore the power of simple being must be none other than its substance. Hence, we may say that simple being has substantial power. Neither could this simple being be a composite of active and passive powers, and therefore it must be purely substantial active power. Moreover, it would also have to be true that the substantial active power of simple being could not be finite, for in that case, this would require some further principle of limitation, which limits this power down to be this or that finite power. But such is not possible in simple being. Hence, the substantial active power must be unlimited. In addition, the power of this simple being cannot be some sort of composite array of powers like there is in us, such as our ability to speak, digest, walk, etc., for this would render simple being a composite. Hence, we may say that the operation of simple being is a simple operation. From these considerations of the power of simple being, since we have concluded that its power is unlimited, we must conclude that it is omnipotent as well, since it does truly have all powers. How about the perfection of simple being? Suppose simple being isn't perfect, and is instead further perfectible. Now, to be further perfectible entails the ability to gain or lose features, so as to be further perfected. But to gain or lose features entails the ability to gain or lose parts, which is out of the question for simple being. Therefore, simple being must be perfect. From perfection follows goodness, for something is good in proportion to its perfectly being what it is by nature. But simple being not only is its own nature, but perfectly so. Therefore, we must say that simple being is indeed good, and not only good in the sense of this being some superadded feature to its substance, but substantial goodness. It is rightly said to be the good. We may also demonstrate that simple being must have intellect, for we remember that whatever is in the effect must in some way be in the cause. Now, what we find in the effects includes their universal patterns and forms. Hence, these universal patterns and forms must be in the universal cause of being, or simple being, in some way. However, they cannot be in simple being in the sense that simple being is an instantiation or individuation or particular instance of any of these forms or universal patterns. For if that were true, there would have to be some sort of composition between this form and a principle of individuation, by which it is made a particular instance of this form. But such a composition is not possible in simple being. So, we conclude that simple being must contain all these forms or universal patterns without being a particular instance of any one of them. But to be able to contain form and universal patterns without being an instance of them is just what it means to have intellect. When considering the perfection of this intellect, and the fact that it is universal cause of being, we infer there must not be any knowledge lacking in it, and must be omniscient. For if there were some knowledge lacking, this would entail further perfectibility, which isn't possible in something which is perfect. To show that simple being has will, we may remember an argument that I made last video, which is that the things caused to be by the universal cause of being do not really add to the perfection of the universal cause of being. It is perfect without the things caused to exist. This applies just as well to simple being. It is perfect with or without the things it causes to exist. But an intellect which causes things to exist which it does not need must have something analogous to a free will, since it is free with regard to whether anything else besides it should exist at all, and if so, what sorts of things should exist. Therefore, we may conclude that simple being must have will in addition to intellect. And just like we noted in the last video, we may readily conclude that there must be life in simple being, since in non-living things it is impossible that they should have intellect and will. But simple being has both intellect and will, therefore it must have life. But to be completely immutable, which is going to entail being without succession, to be perfect, and to have life, is just what it means to be eternal. Therefore, simple being must have eternal life. Let's summarize. In addition to proving there must be simple being, we have proved that it is one, the universal cause of being, subsistent existence itself, purely actual, immutable, pure substance, omnipotent, perfect, good, has intellect, is omniscient, has will, and eternal life. But for there to be something with these attributes is just to say that God exists. Therefore, God exists. Many of the objections against the argument from Change in Part 6 of this series could also be directed at this argument, so the viewer can go back to that video for more objections and responses to those objections. It should be clear, once again, that objections like, what caused that which is altogether simple, make no sense. For there are no parts at all in this thing that would need to be conjoined in order for it to exist, especially at the deepest level of conjoining essence and an active existence. This question would be tantamount to asking, what assembled the parts in that which has no parts whatsoever? Now, if we were talking about some being in which essence and existence were distinct, then yes, this would require a cause for its existence, and just be yet another contingent being, which would have to receive its existence from another. But simple being is not of this sort, and cannot conceivably be, for it does not receive its being from another, and already has it. It is being itself in this sense. One objection against this argument is that its conclusion is allegedly incompatible with the Trinity. But this is a misunderstanding of the Trinity. The teaching does not claim that the three persons of the Trinity are three so-called parts of God which get assembled together. And since the teaching does not claim that they are parts of God, this objection simply has no force. Now, there's lots more to say on this topic in relation between divine simplicity and the Trinity, and my friend Classical Theist has done some good work on this, so I'll simply recommend his videos. But I'll simply say that it's actually a rejection of the simplicity of God, and also a rejection that God's essence is his existence. That would be a major problem for the Trinity, not their acceptance. But saying that God's essence is really distinct from his existence is not only a problem for the Trinity, but also a problem for the fact that God has necessary being, or rather just is necessary being, since anything in which essence is not its existence is simply yet another contingent being among other contingent beings, and thus must receive its existence by way of another. There might just so happen to be one of a certain kind of contingent being, as opposed to two or three. But we don't mean that necessary being is one in the sense that there just so happens to be one, but that necessary being must be one, and there cannot even in principle be many necessary beings, for this would make no sense whatsoever. So anyone who believes that God's essence is not his existence, and believes that God's being is not contingent, is just being incoherent, and has a rationally absurd position. Just like the argument from change, this argument does not depend upon whether the universe began to exist or not. It only depends on whether composite things exist in the here and now, which they do, since the viewer is one example of a composite being. So long as they do, their existence must ultimately be traced back to simple being. For the sake of argument, even if the universe never began to exist, the existence of any composite being could only be possible, ultimately due to simple being. So the argument does not rely on any premise that says that the universe began to exist, and is therefore indifferent to whether it did or not. Please note that the argument does not contain the premise that everything needs a cause, for we have explained why certain things need a cause, namely because they are composite, and require diverse parts to come together in order to exist, which is why they need a cause. Once again, anyone who takes this argument to be saying that everything needs a cause has misunderstood the argument. And one is quite correct to note that this argument does not prove Christianity true. Although I will note as a side comment that because the utter simplicity of God is something we may demonstrate through philosophical argumentation, any religion which teaches something against this truth must be false and rationally absurd. Now, if a religion should completely maintain and teach this truth about God's simplicity, right down to God's essence just being his existence, this would actually be some evidence in its favor, at least from the philosophical aspect.
Sa